Let's look at some genuinely good fantasy weapon designs. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now, I often get asked to critique fantasy weapon designs, and there are many problems with many fantasy weapons designs. Often they're oversized, often they're just impractical, either to hold or they don't make sense in the particular context of that world and world building. And there's, in fact, many different things we have to think about with fantasy weapon design. We could just copy things from history and the real world. And by doing so, you'd end up with a weapon which makes sense, but would it be a good fantasy weapon? I'd argue no. In fact, I'd argue that a good fantasy weapon is something that is different to things, or at least somewhat different to things in the real world, and doesn't look exactly like a carbon copy of something from real world history, and makes sense in the fantasy environment with the creatures and the races and the culture and the history that we've got going on there in that world building. But additionally, something that is new and innovative. So a good fantasy weapon design should obey the laws of physics, such as they are in that particular world, and should make sense, but equally they should be inventive, innovative, creative, imaginative, and they should make sense in that fantasy setting. So when we look at a fantasy weapon, we need to ask, is that person bigger or smaller than a typical real world human? Are they stronger? Are they weaker? Are they faster? How are they built? What are their proportions? Have they got very long arms, very long legs? These types of things. How many limbs have they got? And how would that dictate the weapon design? We also need to think about really fundamental things like, how are their hands designed? We'd also then consider their culture. What does their culture artistically look like? What technology level is it at? And what resources and materials does it have available to it? And what are these weapons for? Who are they going to be used against? Are they going to be used against large creatures? Are they going to be used against creatures that can fly? Aquatic creatures? Are they going to be used against people who are wearing armour or completely unarmoured people? All of these things massively affect the weapons design. So regular viewers of this channel will know that I've been sponsored many times across a long period of time by Raid Shadow Legends. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at 5 really genuinely good weapon designs from Raid Shadow Legends. I'm using Raid as a medium because Raid actually has some really good, well-researched arms and armour in it. Just briefly before I go on, I want to mention that this video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, and they're celebrating their 4th birthday. And to celebrate Raid's 4th anniversary, I've got special offers here for new players and for existing players. And remember, the game's free to download, free to play. First of all, for new players, if you check out that link down below or the QR code that you can scan on screen, you're going to get these bonuses, which are a super awesome hero who is called Kellen the Shrike, as well as ×4 energy refills, ×4 magic potion mid, and ×4 XP brew magic. And if you're an existing player as well, to celebrate the 4th anniversary, there's also some brilliant bonuses by getting into game, and you put the promo code 4 years raid. That's 4 years raid, and you'll get a bunch of free stuff. So go and check it out now with the link below or the QR code on screen, or use that 4 years raid promo code if you're already an existing player, and get playing the game right now. I'm in game as Captain Context, and you can find me on there and possibly join my clan. So let's get back to the main content here, and let's look at 5 awesome fantasy weapons that I genuinely rate as good fantasy weapons, and I'm going to explain why, taking examples from the game Raid itself. So the first example I've got for you here is a guy called Vergis, who's a high elf, and he is armed with a glaive. Now, if we look at this glaive, you'll see that it's not massively oversized, and it's not dissimilar in its basic proportions to various European, Chinese, and Japanese glaives, or naginata and things like Dao and things like that. So it is basically a practical weapon. Now, with this kind of size and not being massively oversized, we can say that this guy's probably close to normal human strength, or should we say athletic human strength. But also, this is a weapon that could be used one-handed as a spear with a shield, for example. It'd be a bit cumbersome for a spear, but nevertheless. Or it could be used two-handed. Now, this makes a lot of sense in Raid because of course there's all sorts of big creatures and monsters you might have to fight. There's great big, hulking great humanoid creatures, but equally there's things like dragons and ice golems and stuff. So having a weapon that packs a lot of punch makes an awful awful lot of sense. Now, a really interesting detail I like, that hopefully you'll be able to see clearly here, is there's a gripping section right below the head of the weapon there. And I actually think that's a really clever piece of design, because it means you can choke up on the weapon and use it a bit like a short sword in conjunction with the shield, or if you're fighting an armoured opponent, if you end up in kind of grappling range as well. So I really like that as a detail. It's not something we necessarily see on most real-world polearms, but it does make sense. Overall, the glaive is a weapon that we see in various different cultures from around the world over a wide period of time, and it's got so many options because it's got a chopping and slashing blade, it's got a thrusting point, and it's got a hook or spike on the back which can be used for pulling and hooking and perhaps even piercing certain types of armour or thick hides of creatures. So I think within the context of raid and just generally as a fantasy weapon, this makes good sense, and I also really like the design of it. It sort of ties in and is harmonious with the artistic style of this high elf armour. Now, the next example I want to show to you is the Sand-Lashed Survivor, as she's called, and she is actually a member of the Orcs, which don't necessarily look like the Orcs you might be used to, but they are what Orcs look like in raid. Now, you can see her armour there. It's sort of rustic and not high-tech, and this of course fits with how orcs are normally portrayed. Now, if we look at her sword-like object, I'll call it, SLO, you'll notice it's basically a big chopper, and this is, again, it's a brutal, fundamental, kind of basic weapon that could be fashioned by the sort of people that make this sort of armour. So again, it looks correct for what we know about the race or species and their technology level. It's not massively oversized. It's about the size of something like a very large two-handed Dao or a Zweihander, I suppose, a small Zweihander Montante, something like this. And also, it's somewhat similar to some of the cleavers that we see in the Morgan Bible in the 13th century. So absolutely, in terms of size and proportions, and therefore we can imagine heft, it does seem plausible by real-world comparisons. Now, from an effectiveness point of view, it seems to have a hologram blade made of some sort of metallic substance, and it's got some lashing or grip wraps wrapped around the base of the blade, so you could kind of like half sword with it or something like that. But it's also got quite a jagged blade with projections sticking out of the bottom there, which again, if you're fighting large creatures with thick hides or indeed people in armour, those sorts of pointy projections are very useful. There's also a really nice detail. If we just zoom in on the pommel there, you can see that the pommel is spiked, and as we know, to end people rightly, a spiky pommel is good news. So I personally think this is a weapon that looks right for an orc in technology level, aesthetically and everything else. It looks rusty, it looks crude, but it also looks effective and isn't ridiculously oversized, and does look like a design that indeed an orc, particularly one wearing armour like her, might use. Now, this next one I really love for a number of reasons. This is Aox the Rememberer, who's a member of the Lizard Men. Now, if you notice, he's basically a kind of toad-like creature. Big, hefty, not that fast moving, I would say, but big and strong and tough with a thick resistant hide. And you'll also notice he uses a lot of magic and stuff, so it's essentially a staff in this case. However, it does actually bear a lot of comparison to some real world staff-like weapons, particularly those found in the Pacific Islands and places like New Zealand, used by the Maoris, and certain other weapons, even Aztec to a degree. And you'll notice that the aesthetic with his tattoos and his feathers and this kind of stuff, and there's feathers even on the weapon, it ties in aesthetically. It looks right. It's got a sort of a mixture of Pacific and kind of, well, South Pacific and kind of South American kind of feel to it. But as a weapon, it also makes sense because, you know what? It's basically a quarterstaff, and there ain't nothing wrong with a quarterstaff. Let's just have a look at it there. So you'll notice that as well as being a shaft, it has a nice big, what looks like wooden head on it, and then feathers for decoration. And we do also find weapons like this in places like Southeast Asia as well, and Borneo and places like that. So particularly with the use of feathers and hair, it makes it a convincing kind of tribal-like weapon. So looking at the technology of his clothes and his gear, I think it makes sense culturally. Also remember, of course, there's no armour shown here. So a lot of the lizard men are quite rudimentary in what they wear, and therefore striking wooden weapons in a place where metal isn't easily available and isn't abundant makes sense both in terms of the technology and what they've got available to them, their tribal kind of feel, but also the effectiveness of the weapon, because hitting with someone with something that's like a botor is still very effective if they're not really wearing anything. Now, sticking with the lizard man theme, and so a lot of things I've just said will be relevant here as well, but very different weapons. This guy is more of a warrior, and he's called Haruspex, and he's got a couple of essentially tomahawks. You can see there. And they are made entirely of organic material. Which I think is absolutely great, because these guys don't have a lot of metal, they don't have a lot of access to a lot of metal. Equally, they don't have a lot of armour, so they don't really need a lot of metal to overcome their opponents. They are big and strong with leathery hides, and he has got armour that's made of organic material, probably of things that he's hunted. And what's really, really cool about these hatchets, as you can see there hopefully, you will notice that the heads are made of parts of some kind of, you know, bone, shoulder blade, or I don't know, jawbone or something, of some creature that he's hunted. I think it's absolutely fantastic. So everything about him ties in logically as a good fantasy weapon. They are organic things that have been harvested from the environment, probably jungle-like, that he lives in, okay? But in terms of weapons as well, they're not oversized, they're not massive, they're not huge, massive double-sided, double-bladed axes or whatever. They are about the size, relative to him anyway, of a largish tomahawk or a kind of Viking hand axe. And they look plausible. They look plausibly made of bone, I think, with teeth or spines, it's difficult to tell which, at the front cutting edge or piercing edge. So I think they make an awful lot of sense as weapons for his culture, and they look like a completely believable weapon. But do you know what makes them really great fantasy weapons? Is the fact that they look different to most things in our real world. So they are a great fantasy weapon that ticks all of the boxes. And just to make that real world comparison again, we absolutely have examples from the real world, specifically of Pacific islands, where things like shark teeth were used and incorporated into weapons where there was no metal, and they used only teeth and horns and things like this to make their weapons out of. So this is, whilst it's a completely fresh and innovative new idea, it's based on real world knowledge. And the final example I'm going to give, someone completely different, very, very different type of character, is called Malbranch. And so I don't know why I said that in French accent. And she is the demon spawn. So she's kind of like devil-like from a hell-like place. And obviously there's some iconography here that looks like medieval devils, okay? The fact is she is using a fork, a military fork. Now, a couple of things. First of all, forks and tridents are associated with devils in medieval iconography first. Second thing is that the military fork itself was a weapon that was used in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. So much so that you even get military fork hybrid with halberds as well. But anyway, so a military fork, look at the size of it. It's absolutely acceptable in size. It's about the same length as her size. It doesn't look overweight, doesn't look over thick. It looks completely believable. So yes, it would work as a weapon. We're assuming she's similar to a strong human. Although I guess if it was all made of metal, which is difficult to tell, if it was all made of metal, then indeed she could be stronger than a typical human. But nevertheless, there she is, normal size weapon, but a believable military weapon. But there are some really cool fantasy aspects to this weapon which make it a good fantasy weapon rather than just a good weapon. First of all, it's ambiguous what it's made of. If we zoom in and actually look at the head of it there, you can't really see what the material is. It's not clearly made of iron or steel. It might be made of some rare kind of metal that you only get down there in those caverns. So that's the first thing. It's the ambiguousness of how it's made and what it's made of, which instantly makes it look different to real world weapons. I feel this is a good example for the demon spawn. So we don't really know a lot about the demon spawn. They're supposed to be mysterious. They're supposed to have access to magic and materials that we don't, or that normal people in Raid Shadow Legends don't. So therefore, the fact that they have a mysterious looking weapon that looks different to most other, most of the kind of knights and stuff that you get in Raid Shadow Legends, I think that's right. It looks like an otherworldly weapon. And again, in a fantasy environment where these people would have to fight against all sorts of, demons and giant creatures and dragons and ogres and stuff like this, a weapon that packs a lot of punch makes a lot of sense, and a large two-handed military fork, potentially made of, the whole thing made of metal, makes sense. Forks also have the benefits of you can parry with the forks, you can catch things, you can push things away a bit like a boar spear because they don't over penetrate like a single pointed spear would, and you can encounter armored opponents with them and all sorts. So it makes sense within the context of this world, that particular weapon, and potentially you could even strike with it like a mace. To me, one of the coolest things about this design, let's see if we can get it, if you notice just there, it's got a wound element around the top of the shaft there, and if we go out to the other end, it has at the far end as well there. Okay, hopefully you can see the back end just by my finger there. And one of the cool things about this is it looks like a spiral round metallic bar or strip. And we actually find this on a number of historical real-world weapons. Number one, we find it on poleaxes and halberds sometimes, another lucerne hammer and things like that. And it's a way of protecting the shaft from an opponent's weapon. So if it's a wooden shaft, it protects it from being cut by blades. But we also find it used on Sudanese spears, for example, both at the top and the bottom, and sometimes spears from places like Zimbabwe as well in Africa. And these are used as balancing or weight addition elements. Or, as I mentioned, you could be striking with this to turn it into a mace. So in essence, those bound strips, and again, it's mysterious because it's the demon spawn, and we're not supposed to know too much about them. Those wound elements could be interpreted as protecting the shaft, or they could be interpreted as aiding balance, or they could be interpreted as adding mass for more momentum for striking with. Either way, we don't really need to know. The end result is a weapon that looks partially inspired by real-world historical counterparts and partly complete fantasy, and therefore it doesn't look like anything from our real world. And neither does she, of course. So I think it's a really good example of a good, well-designed, well-thought-out, logical fantasy weapon. So to sum up, good fantasy weapons have to take into consideration a whole bunch of different things to do with the fantasy world building, the people using them, who they're using them against, and also bring in some historical inspiration and what actually makes sense in the laws of physics and things like this. I'm not saying that all of the weapons in Raid Shadow Legend are necessarily good. There are some weapons in there that I go, and are not my cup of tea, but I've picked out what I genuinely consider to be 5 great examples of fantasy weapon design that you can find in Raid Shadow Legends. And just to remind you once again, Raid are the sponsors for this video. If you want to check it out, if you're a new player, check out the link below or the QR code on screen, and you can get all of those bonuses, being Kellen the Shrike, 4 times energy refills, 4 times magic potion mid, and 4 times XP brew magic. And if you're an existing player, then you can use that promo code 4YearsRaid to celebrate their 4th anniversary, and you'll get a bunch of free gifts as well. So thanks to Raid for sponsoring this video. I hope it's been enjoyable. Obviously, I've just used Raid to illustrate this. We could, in the future, look at other things, movies, general fantasy art, or particular graphic novels. But there hopefully is a vehicle, this has been a vehicle for looking at what good fantasy weapons should look like and how you should go about world building to explain why certain people, creatures, characters, whatever, are using the weapons they are. And it should make your fantasy world more believable. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. Cheers, folks.